Hey, 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 hey. Let's see. Let's get my setup going here. Make sure people know that I'm live. Oh no, I'm live at the same time as Jason. I didn't intend for that to happen. Hoo boy. Well, I know where we'll be rating after this is over. Let's see here. Hey, everybody. JVN Allen. JVAN Allen. Yeah, I do know who the true fans are. Even Chris Biscardi is dropping by, which is a total honor, uh, given that he probably would be on Jason's stream. Yeah, Chris, I really have appreciated how you've been writing about your process. You should keep doing that and talking about it. It's very helpful. Doing DevRel and content and stuff is a really weird animal. Jay Van Allen, you know Van Allen like the radiation bell. Awesome. Nice. Yeah, so I'm trying an experiment today, and we'll see. It'd be great if we have some more peeps. Let me tweet out really quick. Uh, So I'm trying an experiment today, um, because I've got to finish building out under a different username. Hi. I'm pretty happy with what I have now. Need to update my post with some stuff. Yeah, it'd be cool to see. Welcome, Tuli Creme. That's a cool username. Yeah, Chris, it'd be cool to see a little bit more, especially like on the React podcast. You talked about the kind of micro blogging idea or something like that, which was really cool. I've been thinking a lot about the same thing, the concept of doing less but doing it more frequently. I think that's a key. Sometimes there are times where you need to do a big launch. Like when I made upgrading Angular JS, I kept that pretty quiet until I actually launched it. But that was kind of a specific case because it was for a specific problem. Um, but yeah, I think in general, this idea of doing less frequently, um, that's a really cool idea, though, of what you're doing. Tuli Creme says it's the brand name of a really lousy Nutella-like stuff, but it actually tastes like something to grease doorknobs and stuff. That's a shame. I love Nutella. Um, that's really funny. So I thought I'd do an experiment today because I did a shorter version of this token authentication talk for Angular Denver, and it was okay. It was like a 10-minute lightning talk, which if you're new to building talks, shorter talks are harder than longer talks because you have to compress your information a lot more. So I had 2 talks to build for Angular Denver. One of them was about upgrading with Angular Elements, which was like pretty complicated. And that was a 25-minute talk. And so this talk, it was fine. It wasn't really. I could have done better. But now I have the opportunity. I'm going to be giving a full length version of this NGRX authentication talk in a couple different places. The the next one being Angular Mix in Las Vegas in like 9 days. So I thought this might be an interesting stream because what I have to do is expand this talk from the 10-minute version to the like 25, 30-minute version. And I'm going to be giving it in a couple different places. And I thought people ask me a lot. I am by no means like I'm still like a Z list a Z-lister in the speaking game. I've only been doing it for I've only been speaking at conferences for a little over a year. I'd been speaking at meetups for a few years. But I've started to have some modicum of success recently, and so I'm like one rung above the of the ladder of like wanting to start, maybe two rungs up the ladder of like going from never speaking to speaking at conferences, and now it's part of my job. So I love explaining, like I love teaching people, and I firmly believe that if you want to speak or teach, then you should be able to. Doesn't matter who you are or what you look like or any of that stuff. And so um yeah, so I thought this would be interesting because it's not starting from scratch. Starting from scratch would take way too long um to do, but I will show you sort of how I start a talk from scratch and then kind of walk through some of the process. Uh what do you think your gateway to being able to speak at conferences? So for me, I will say I do live in Portland. Well, I did at the time. I don't live in Portland anymore. I live out in the country, as has kind of become my brand. But I did live in Portland at the time, and it was like right in 2014, which was like the framework wars. So there were a lot of meetups, and they were always looking for speakers. So that's how I kind of got into speaking, through giving talks at meetups in Portland. I started at the Angular JS meetup, and also I think I talked at a couple of JavaScript meetups, TypeScript, Node. So I basically just started by speaking at as many local meetups as possible. That's a pretty common route to go. I do know people who have skipped that entirely and given their very first talk ever at a big conference. I just feel like that's a lot more rare. Like Kim Maida, my boss, she got accepted to a conference straight away, and that's how she started speaking. And like, so she's a good testimony for, like going big right out of the gate. I couldn't do that. I applied to a bunch of conferences in, I don't know, 2015, 2016, that time. Couldn't figure it out. And so spent 2016 and 2017 basically speaking at meetups, and then moved on. Actually, the first conference I got accepted to was Angular Mix in 2018. First one I actually spoke at was Angular Denver in 2018. And since then, I've done NGConf, Angular Connect, a lot of that stuff. But for me, I just love teaching more than anything. I honestly love teaching people to code more than actually coding myself, which is probably dumb, but I really like I really like it. I really like I feel like programming has this unique ability to actually change people's lives in a way that not many careers are positioned to do. And so like I mentored a coworker at my last job who wanted to become a programmer, and that was a really crystallizing experience for me because it resulted in him getting like a massive raise, going from a reporting analyst to a junior developer, which, of course enables him to make a lot more progress in his life. And that like really, that was, I got more joy out of that than anything I've ever built myself. So I'm kind of finding the same thing with speaking and enabling people to speak. And so when I wrote an article on applying to conferences, so I'm not going to I'll link that in the chat. So I'm not going to spend much time on the CFP process. I'll just talk about what's it called? Building the actual talk and sort of going through that process. Since this is interesting because it was partway done as a 10-minute talk, and so I'm sort of expanding it and revising it and giving it another shot. But generally speaking, what I do and I highly recommend, is I generally start by the working on the code first. So we've just spent the last few streams working through this Nostalgia Mart NGRX app. We've added authentication to it, and I was doing this as a way to prep for building this talk. In addition to just, I actually have to do it for a number of reasons because it's part of my job to figure out Auth0 with different technologies. So I needed to adapt this to NGRX, but part of it was to keep it fresh on my mind about like what the process is for doing token authentication in NGRX. So starting with the code, it doesn't have to be, this is a very elaborate sample, and I purposely have made this example app very elaborate just because of all the different reasons I want to use it later. I'm going to use it for a lot of content. But you don't need to do that. You just need to make the most straightforward coding example you can of what you're trying to talk about and build it. You might need to build it a couple of times to keep it fresh, but what I do is I try really hard to pay attention to the steps, because what I've found is that often when you're the way you naturally might explain something, whether it's in writing or in speaking, is not always the same way that you would code it. And I find that I have more success with content that is explaining things in the order in which you would actually code it, or at least I would. That's just like my opinion, man. But for example, like authentication is actually a really great example, because realistically, you really aren't going to add authentication until like you're almost done with the application, because it adds a lot of friction to developing new features. Like if you're just trying to get something out the door, you don't want to have to log in every single time you're testing your like the features that you're writing, right? Like that'd be a huge pain. So in the real world, you're not going to add authentication like right out of the gate. So that's a good example of that. Often the same is true of like routing or things like that. Like you might naturally, if you're explaining to someone, you're like, oh, like, yeah. And so then after you add this feature, then you add this router over here, and then you point these things. But like, you might not actually build out that routing until later on. Anyway, so that's sort of, that's a long-winded way of saying to start with the code. The code will be your friend. I take extensive notes in this, and I typically do it in an app called Ulysses. It doesn't really matter. Just find something that works for you. I pretty much think in Markdown these days because of all the writing that I've done. So there's a number of great applications that do that. Another one is called Bear. It doesn't really matter, but I try to keep together, like for my different talks. Well, this isn't a great example because I had to do a bunch of talks all at once, but I keep together different resources. Here's the notes I took here's the CFP. This is for my facades talk at Angular Connect. And here's what I got a little bit just so far for NGRX Auth. I just said that I take extensive notes, and now I'm demonstrating that I don't actually take extensive notes, so that's kind of silly. But, well, the elements one is actually a really good one, because that was a very complicated subject. So I met with Aaron Coughlin from Google, and I wrote out these different outlines. I had different sample ideas. What I really like about the Super Nintendo thing that's the Nostalgia Mart app. You can go back and look at the streams. I'll show you in just a second. I really like Ulysses because it lets you group together chunks of content, or things that you're working on. So for work, I have these different groups, or for conferences, or for blog posts, and then like inside of that, see, I wasn't even lying. I am thinking about microblogging. I can keep together different ideas that are grouped together. So I really like that. The Super Nintendo reference is just this app that I've been building. I'll just run it really quick. But I basically wanted to I wanted to recreate the books collection platform, or books collection example app that the NGRX repo has. But the thing with that is that it's meant to demonstrate a lot of different things, and so it's hard to understand how to build it from scratch. So that's the purpose of this this little sample app. But instead of using books, I wanted to use video games because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and so I wanted to see the stuff that I cared about as a kid. So this is what it looks like. I'm using the games database, IGDB, to pull in the top-rated Super Nintendo games and the top-rated Nintendo games, and I'm using NGRX for that. And it's still got a lot of work to do, but I'm using it as a guinea pig to test out a lot of different stuff with NGRX and with Auth0 in that. Ben Cabanas, I never know how to pronounce all of these Twitch handles, but you are very welcome. I hope it's helpful for people. So that's the silly little app. I'm actually not using, because this talk was already in a shorter format. I'm not actually using this sample code for this talk. But it's okay. I've got some shortcuts for that to make it all right. But I will be able to pull it into the slides. So this is where the talk is at right now. And I use Keynote. I've used a lot of different things. I've used slides.com. I've used Google Slides. And then I switched to Keynote once I was using a Mac. It doesn't matter. In the end, it doesn't really matter. Now that's the thing you have to, like, you can nerd out on, like, you can refine your process for writing or speaking or building videos or whatever, and you can get really sophisticated with it. And often I find that for people like me who are perfectionists or who tend to be overthinkers, we think too hard about the tools and about doing it perfectly, when really we just need to, like, get something shipped, like get something out there and refine the process later. I realized yesterday as I was thinking about it that I recorded the first videos for upgrading AngularJS with, like, a headset mic. Like, that's all I had. So I just started recording it, and you know what? It went fine and people bought it. And, and then I upgraded to a Yeti mic, and then Egghead generously sent me a new mic to work on their videos. And so the same thing is true of the slides. Like, you can do a lot with different tools. I've gotten into Keynote because it's what my friends have been using and said, and so we share tips and tricks. And by friends, I explicitly mean Kim Maida and Mike Ryan. We've sort of become this, like, speaking posse that shares slide tricks and stuff like that. And I don't, if you've ever seen one of Kim's talks, she's like the master of animations and stuff like that, and it's amazing. So she's taught me a lot of stuff. So your chat says you're saying we should be agile instead of trying to be perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Our head of marketing at Auth0, Gonto, likes to say you should ship something and be a little bit embarrassed about it. He said if you're not a little bit embarrassed about what you're shipping, then you're waiting too late. And I think that's really good. I've also heard this explained as, like, the 85% or 80% rule of, like, get something 80% of the way there and put it out there and refine it later. Yeah, or the 80-20 rule. Yeah, there's a lot of different incarnations of this principle. Ben, while creating your talk, do you focus on a specific part of your subject or try to cover all the nitty gritty about it? That's a great question. So, it really depends a lot on how much time you have in the talk. Generally, though, I find that that less is more. The simpler you can explain something, like, well, first of all, like, I once asked John Papa, like, what one of his, like, best pieces of advice would be for speaking, and he said that keep in mind that any talk under 30 minutes is actually not about teaching code. It's actually about emotion. It's about helping people feel like they are empowered to do something. So when think about when you watch an ngconf talk or any sort of conference talk. First of all, you're probably going to, if it's something really technical, you're gonna pause it a lot. You're gonna rewatch it. You're gonna go through it a few times or something if it's something that you actually really need to implement. But when you're present at the conference, which is the audience that you're speaking to, they don't get that luxury, right? So you have to you're there more to inspire people while also being competent and having something for them to go back to once the recording is up and you can share sample code and things like that. But generally speaking, if you have less than 30 minutes, don't worry too much about trying to go step by step deep dive into a lot of stuff. Welcome, Chris, my good friend. Thanks for being here. So if you are going to do a deep dive step by step thing, then keep the scope of it really simple. Keep it not simple. It doesn't have to be beginner level. I just mean take one piece of it and thoroughly explain it. So is it more about making your subject accessible and the form of the talk, trying to break the entry barrier? It can be a lot of different things. I'm trying to think of some good examples. So one of the classic, one of the examples of something that gets brought up over and over again is Jake Archibald's talk on the event loop. This gets, if you ask anybody, let's see. Well, there's two. There's Jake Archibald's, and then which one? There's also Philip Roberts. That was a really great event loop talk as well. So this is Philip Roberts' talk. But if you look at Jake Archibald's, if you just search for Jake Archibald event loop, this is a really good example of this. So, both of these are actually excellent. I guess Philip's came first, because that's 5 years ago. So this is the one I'm kind of thinking of. But he took something very, very complicated in JavaScript and broke it down into a very understandable way. And all he did was explain the event loop. He didn't talk about a bunch of other asynchronous things or how other things work in JavaScript. So it depends a lot on what your goal is. Is the goal of the talk to what do you want the audience to be able to do or understand at the end, right? When I was building out talks on the upgrade process, I quickly realized that that's a really complicated process. And so in 30 minutes, I'm not going to be able to explain the entire process of migrating from AngularJS to Angular. That would only leave people exasperated and frustrated. So instead, you have to focus on one job that you want them to be able to feel like they can accomplish. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay. So another thing, I always leave the generally what I do with slides, once I have the notes and the code, please don't bring up upgrading. I know it's a painful subject. I think we're almost, it's funny because there's still so many people who are in the middle of upgrading. It's crazy. It's such a long, painful process. And I think we're all really tired of it. Luckily, the process is a lot better now than it was a few years ago. But so once I have all the code and the notes kind of hammered out, then I usually just start adding as basic slides as possible. So yeah, the worst part of upgrading is convincing people. That was actually my ngconf talk last year, was about convincing my boss about upgrading. It was It's interesting. You have to approach it from like the business standpoint with like empathy for the business, how it's going to save time and money, not how it's going to make your life easier, which is unfortunate. So these slides, because they're already from a previous talk, they're already styled to some extent. Like there's already a color scheme. I've got a picture here already. If I were starting this from scratch, I would just use black and white or white and black, and trust me, waiting till the end to style is the way to go, because what you want to do is flesh out as much as possible the flow of your talk. For me, I'm a very visual person, so I just added these yesterday. Like I'm gonna add like a diagram of what the typical authentication flow is, and then how it looks in NGRX, and I would just add these kind of placeholder slides as I go, and then flesh out what they look like later. If you try to, when I was first starting to build talks, I would try to like think of things like the color scheme and the like design and stuff like that on the front end, at the beginning, and that was a disaster, because then sure enough, as I was thinking through how to explain it, it would change, and I'd have to go back and like apply styling to new slides. It's really not fun. So flesh out the content first. If I open up, I'm gonna be doing, let's see, I don't know if I have, no, I don't. I thought I had some, I have to build a talk on Gatsby authentication, and I thought I had started that. Maybe it's on my other computer. But yeah, so I basically, I'll save, I won't work on the introduction or the conclusion until the very end, because you don't know what those are when you're first starting. Just get into the meat of the subject and flesh it out. So like when I did this 10-minute talk, all I really did was I went over state effects and actions and how they work in authentication, in sort of the basic authentication flow. And I don't love this structure. I'm gonna change that a bit, because I want this talk to be actually more of an architecture talk than just sort of isolated pieces of code. So what I want to do is explain how in vanilla Angular, your authentication service is like the brain of your application with the authentication stuff, whereas in NGRX, it gets split up into state and actions and effects and reducers and selectors and all that stuff. And it's on the surface, it's more complicated, but it's actually easier to debug and easier to understand. Who else remembers the phrase easier to reason about? That's like basically a drinking game. There was a time, I think when Redux was first coming out, that like everywhere you looked, you heard the phrase easier to reason about, and it was hilarious. Okay. So I'm going to kind of refactor some of this talk, because I don't really want to come at it from this way. And I thought about just like starting from scratch with this, but I don't want to have to like redo all the styling and everything. So I want to show the typical diagram. I want to show the NGRX diagram, and then I'm going to want to do something like zoom into different pieces of it or something like that. And I will end up covering these things, but I didn't talk about reducers or selectors in here, and I do want to talk about that in this version of the talk. And so because of that, intuitively, I can feel that like having like 5 different things, it's not a cohesive unit. Like it's just sort of here's a random assortment of facts, and I don't want that. I'd rather tell a story about adding authentication to NGRX. And that's another really good thing to try to do when you're building a talk, is like incorporate some sort of narrative of what you would be doing. So the best talks tend to involve some element of discovery, some element of like you discovering something with the audience. Like you have to kind of recreate that. If you just get up on stage and you're like, here are the 5 things that you have to do when you're talking about or when you're adding authentication, then it's going to be dry and boring and people aren't going to remember it. If you go up there and you're like, okay, I have to add sort of like what we do when we're naturally coding. We're like, okay, well, I've got to add this login button, right? So I add the login button, but then, okay, how do I process the redirect there? Well, I need an effect that's going to call out to my authentication SDK. So the element of discovery is what keeps people interested. And that's what I can always tell when I don't have that in a talk because it doesn't feel the same way to me. It feels boring to me. And that's kind of how I felt about this one. I don't feel like I did a good job of it. I mean, it was fine. It was a decent talk, but I want to make it great for the next times that I give it when it's full length. And then everybody always asks about these code slides. So I may as well just tell you. The secret to these animations, like when it's going to be really hard to demonstrate this because of like the screen resolution and stuff in OBS. But all you need to do to add these cool code things is add like a semi-transparent covering and then add a dissolve transition from them between them. It looks nice. Okay. So gonna build that out. Gonna build out the NGRX diagram. I mean, I guess I may as well just do it. Adam Savage made the comment as he was doing with Mythbusters, storytelling is the art to making great TV. Yeah, definitely. Storytelling is key. So when I add placeholder slides, I just add like literally like a piece of text to go through and know what I'm trying to do here. And then I go back and I add like the graphics and the diagrams and the funny GIFs and code is another thing that you kind of wait until you know what you're doing as far as the structure, because getting this code syntax highlighting is kind of a pain. Like editing this code syntax coloring is kind of a pain. I've got some like shortcuts, some tricks to paste it in there, and then I save the colors. Well, I haven't in this one, but I generally save the colors into Keynote like this, and that way I can quickly update things. So let's do that real quick. Do I have the orange already? Yeah, I do. So I've got the 4 colors. What's this one? Is this just white? Will save yourself a lot of time if you save these colors. So let's see. I may as well for now, even though I'm not going to keep this, I just want to remember this for the future. Because I'm going to something like this. I'm not going to keep this, but another thing is try to avoid using bulleted lists any way you can. People just have this like built-in psychological thing where as soon as they see a bulleted list, their eyes glaze over and they stop paying attention to you. So the more interesting and visual you can keep things, the better. So I'm just thinking through, instead of doing like state actions, things like that, I want to talk about building the authentication workflow, which is what I kind of experienced as I was doing these other streams. Can I lift this mic up? I'm gonna try to adjust my mic here to let me sit up better. So let me think about when I was adding this stuff in. What I had to do was built out, I had to add an auth module. And in that module, I made an auth service. But what was tricky about the auth service was that it kind of just becomes a wrapper for the SDK. There's not a whole lot of business logic happening in here because that ends up happening in effects. And that's sort of what I want to, that's sort of the main point of the talk. Ben is asking, do you create animations or GIFs for complex flow diagram to add more impact? Yes, I do. I typically will add those kinds of animations in towards the end. If we look at my elements talk, let me see if I can show. It's really hard to show these things. Because Keynote doesn't really let you, if I play this, it's going to go full screen, which is annoying. But I typically will use things like, if we look at this one, where we have like arrows come up and use like shading and highlighting. Let's see. And then, of course, I mean, the most famous is me and Mike collaborated on this group by talk that has some very sophisticated animations. I don't have all the fonts in here, do I? Mike did a lot of these and taught me how to do them. But so we'll have, why is this? Let me zoom this. There we go. The fonts are off in here because I don't have them on this computer, but we do things like this, and then down here is where we have our like very sophisticated animations where, how do we do this? How do I preview this? Yeah, it's hard to show. I've got to find a way to like demonstrate these animations on the stream because Keynote doesn't actually let you. Yeah, you'll only be able to see that partially. But yes, the more animations you have, the better. It's really easy to go way off into the deep end of perfecting animations, but it's almost always worth it. I find the more visual you can make something. They don't have to necessarily be very complex, but like so in this animation we have like the circles like go up and go away based on the order, whereas like with concat map they're all in a row. So I'm just going to add a couple of notes here. I want to talk about adding the auth module. I want to talk about adding the auth service. And I want to mention the fact that like it's different because there's less business logic in there. Or there's less just general logic in there. It's more of a placeholder. Before that, I want to talk about defining state. So I want to talk about defining auth state, which sort of goes into this. So I'll move this stuff around. I also want to talk about defining the reducers, thinking through when does state change when you're authenticating, and then defining selectors. So what kinds of pieces of the store do we need to access in the components? And again, these are just placeholder slides. So we'll walk through that process. And then that kind of naturally leads to when we start thinking about the authentication service, that's when we start thinking about effects. But before that, we'd want to define our actions. So actions are going to go probably between defining state and defining reducers. So defining actions goes in there. Because that's typically how you start architecting things. You're like, you think through the state of the app, and then you think of the actions that you're going to want to dispatch. Then you start building out the reducers and selectors. Then those things actually have to do something. And the reducers part starts leading you to think through the effects. Let's see here. Okay, so then adding the auth service, which will then lead to effects. So instead of making this like concept based, it's more like the natural flow of how you're doing things. I'm still going to cover, there's actually an animation here as well. Let's see if you can see it. It's very hard to preview, but basically this moves up and then these two appear because I'm simulating. You click login, you log into your provider, it sends you back to the application, and then you have either success or error, which I'm going to modify this a bit, but okay. Okay, so I'm going to rearrange this. I'm going to get... So I'm just going to make a note. We're going to walk through how adding auth to NGRX is different than in Angular. Since I have 25 or 30 minutes, I'll probably also get into adding the token to the API call. So I'll probably add that. But I probably will try to run through. That's another thing I do is I will run through the talk as soon as I have a decent number of slides, like a decent enough structure. They don't have to be done. They can still be placeholder slides, but I will practice talking through things and just pretend like the slides are complete or that the code is complete in the slides. In order to, I always want to get a sense of the flow of the talk, and that's the amount of time that it's taking to explain everything. So I may, typically I'll like practice it as if I were actually doing it. So I'll start a timer and I'll use a remote, like a presenter remote, and I'll just do it as if I were doing it. But I'll usually wait until there's like at least enough structure. But I'm pretty close. I'm actually pretty close to that because I already have a lot of this other stuff. I'm really just repackaging it. So I'm gonna move this stuff around. This is gonna go somewhere up here. or get deleted. But the auth module, then I'm going to talk about state. So I'm going to move all this stuff up. Oh, actually, there's a great trick for rearranging. If you go to this light table mode, you get a top-down view of all your slides. So you can start moving everything around. And that's exactly what I need to do. So I need to, actually, it'd probably be faster to just move auth state. Yeah, so adding the auth module, define auth state. So it'd be faster to just move these things down, because I'm going to move them like down in here. Because what I want to do is talk through adding the auth module and then defining the state, because you want to think through like what goes in the store. And that's going to be things like the token, whether you're authenticated, the user, that kind of thing. Going to talk about not storing tokens in local storage. Then I'm going to talk through reducers and selectors. So I basically need to duplicate these and modify them. So I'll do that. Actually, that's going to be after actions. So because I want to talk about state and then I want to talk about actions. But the thing that's different that I'm going to change is, one thing you don't really want to do is you want to focus. It's sort of like in sales, there's this idea of focusing on benefits over features. So you don't want to say things like saying something like defining your selectors is just sort of like the technical way of saying it. What you're really saying is like using pieces of state elsewhere in your application, or like, how do I get, I especially like to frame it in questions when I'm building a talk. Like, okay, in my UI, how do I show a button based on whether the user is logged in? And that's what would lead me to talking about selectors. So Ben asks, before doing your slides, do you write down topics and what you want to show and explain, or do you start doing the slides right away? I actually hammer out things before, I hammer it out to the best of my ability before I do it. Let me see if I can find my ngconf. I think I did all of that in Google Docs. For my ngconf 5-minute talk, I went really nuts on preparing ahead of time. I kind of did like the ideal way of doing it. It's not always practical to do it that way, but let me see if I can just pull it up really quick on my Google Drive, because I don't mind showing people. Let's see, ngconf submissions. So for my ngconf talk, I went, this is overkill than what I would do for a typical talk, but because I had that's like 1,500 people, 5 minutes in front of 1,500 people, I went really, really nuts. I actually like wrote out everything. But before I got to writing it out, this started as an outline. I outlined what I was talking about, and then I started fleshing out exactly what slides I would have. This is sort of one extreme. I wouldn't go to this extreme 90% of the time. What I would do is outline things. So I think I've got actually a lot of stuff on Google Docs from before I actually started using Ulysses. So let me see. Yeah. Okay, here we go. This is really what I wanted to show you. I didn't realize I had all this stuff still in Google Docs, but I make a couple notes, but then I really start outlining things. There's that one. let me find, I think my Angular Connect talk from last year might have that. Let's see. Angular Connect, Angular Mix. Here's another one. This is what I did this was an Angular Mix talk I did. So I fleshed out the outline. So I will try to outline what I can, and then I build out those really simple slides based on this. Because what I like then is once I have, basically I'll just make like placeholder slides for each of these outline items. And what I like about that is then I have a visual way of just like moving things around to restructure the talk. And so that seems to work really well for me. I've been trying to figure out if there's an automated way for me to just translate an outline into Keynote slides. I think I can do it with like Apple Script or something like that. But I haven't done it yet. So you're writing down the structure ideas for the topics you want to talk about, then build the slides. Yes, for sure. For sure. I at least make a bunch of notes on what I want to talk about, and then I outline the best I can what I think the talk is going to look like. Usually the outline ends up being fairly different than what the actual talk turns out to be. Because when you think through something linearly, it actually turns out often it's not the way that you would learn something. It's like sort of a random, like you think it's like a linear structure, and then it turns out to not really be the natural way of explaining something. Because you want to explain something like starting from, you want to make this progression to where people are able to understand what you're saying. Wonder if there's a good example of that. This one actually stayed relatively similar to it, the upgrading with elements talk. But I have had other talks where outlining kind of was a good starting point, but then the structure turned out to be pretty different because it's not linear. Okay. So let me go back to that lightbox mode or light table mode and look at this. So we'll have the diagram, we'll have the auth module, we'll talk about state, we'll talk about what goes in the store. I'm going to talk about UI authentication state versus like auth status state, which is a weird thing. Then I'll get into actions, review good action hygiene, start showing some code, which I need to update because my philosophy on this has changed a little bit. Then I'll get into reducers and selectors. Then I'll get into effects. See, I can already see just by looking at this visually that I'm sort of burying the lead. I'm already 45 slides in before I get to this, which is basically the point of the talk. Like the main thing that I want people to walk away with from this talk I do want to go over sort of the basic steps of doing like the flow of authentication. But the main point of the talk, because the trickiest part of doing this is understanding how effects play into the authentication flow. That like the biggest difference between the two, other than of course like just the Redux pattern in general, is going to be that the authentication service in Vanilla.js, which is going to be a bunch of stuff wrapped in observables and that kind of thing with behavior subjects and all that, you do a lot of processing. So what I want to do is I'll show some differences of like a service in, that's a good slide for here. We'll have like an Angular service, like the vanilla Angular service. And then I'm going to do like, Well, it won't be the whole service. It'd be like a method, like maybe handle redirect callback or something. And then we'll do the same with NGRX auth service method. Because for example, in the auth service here, handle redirect callback is just wrapping the SDK. It's not actually, there's not actually much happening here. Whereas in the effect, if I go to auth.effects, the handle redirect, most of the logic is actually happening in the effect, because what has to happen is it listens for the handle redirect action. That gets dispatched. It checks to see if we have the code. If that's there, it calls handle redirect success, or it calls handle redirect callback on the auth service, gets that result, and then dispatches another action. So it's very tempting. It's very tempting when you're building a talk to add a lot of fluff around introducing a problem. And a skill I've been finding that you have to develop as you're building talks is understanding where to cut that and just get to the point. Because I kind of have to decide what the structure of this talk really is. Do I want it to be a walkthrough of authentication, or do I want it to be more about effects and services and things like that? Because it's 25 to 30 minutes, depending on the conference, I'll probably just make it a little bit more comprehensive. I would say if this were a 20-minute ngconf talk or something, I would probably zoom that. 20 minutes is not very much time at all. So I would probably cut out quite a bit and not try to focus on that. Ofex asks, did you ever use IoT to improve your organic farm by using JavaScript? Not yet. We've sort of been taking the time to understand what we need to do. This doesn't count as IoT, but we have our chicken light on a timer. But for example, one thing that could be cool is to have the chicken door on a servo and connect it to a button or something and open and close the chicken door. What's complicated about that is that it also has we have to keep out animals. So it's not just the door. We actually put this metal rod in front of it and stuff to protect the, raccoons are really crafty. So that was an idea we had. We could do something similar with the lighting in there, but it turns out one of those little double plug lighting timers actually works pretty well instead of having to unplug. And we used to have to unplug the daytime light, plug in the heat lamp at night. Now it just runs on a timer. It would also be cool. Another option I want to do with the chickens that could be cool for IoT is we only want to feed the chickens at night. We don't want to have their feed available during the day. So let me see here. Rachel White, a long time ago, it was 5 years ago, made this thing called RoboKitty. Let me find it, pull it up. Where she made this automated cat feeder. And it'd be cool to figure out some way of doing something similar with the chickens. What I don't know is chickens are very pattern oriented. So I don't know right now, so we have the chicken feeder up on this string, on this wire, and we pull it up during the day and then we put it down, hang it down at night. And I don't know if that's important, if other than if we leave it down, but shut, you can't get to the food, will that have the same effect as actually taking it away from the chickens? So I'll have to figure that out. But yeah, there's some ideas. We moved in too late to start doing a lot of planting, so we haven't done. We don't really have anything planted yet, so we need to get to that. I mean, there were already fruit trees and stuff on the property, but Um, but yeah, that's sort of where we're at with this stuff. Let's see, where were we? I do want to. The thing is, like, the thing with IoT and Integrity Farms. Uh, I love South Park. The thing with IoT and like planting and stuff like that is it uses power, right? I mean, so you have to be smart about when, like, where you actually have power. If you don't have power, you're going to need some sort of battery source. If you need internet, that's a whole other thing. Like, I would like to do something. One thing I would really like to do is have like a live stream of the chickens, like a camera that I could have up in the corner of when I stream. I think that'd be hilarious. Just like the chickens out in the yard. But I have to figure that out because that requires like a camera and also the internet to reach out there, and I'm not sure it would actually work. It might be able to just like take a picture, but I don't think I could do full streaming video. So yeah, IoT with farming is it's tricky. But I'd like to do, when we start doing planting, I'd like to do some stuff with like soil monitoring and that kind of thing. But that'll probably all be next year. So that's the update. That's the update on the chickens. Let's close this stuff. So my dilemma here is like, I want to make this an explanatory, walkthrough of NGRX authentication, but I want to do it in a way that's not going to be super overwhelming and that will keep people interested. Because I feel like the most boring talks are the ones that are just like step-by-step instructions on something. They're fine. Like, you can make a decent one, but there's got to be some like secret sauce to keep people engaged. And that's not just like smoke and mirrors. That's actually like an educational tool. Like, when people remember something, it's going to be because there's some emotional component or some sort of like story that's involved, some way that they can relate it to themselves, maybe like a funny analogy or something like that. So I don't really want this to just to be a dry step-by-step, here's how to do this. What I'll have to figure out, though, is how to kind of like spice that up. But typically what I have to do is define, like, I have to write out the boring version, and then I have to figure out how to tweak it and how to make it better. You can see I've already got Mike Ryan always says actions are the gluten of the NGRX loaf. So I found this picture of this GIF of a dog inside it, multiple dogs with pieces of bread on them. It's silly. I like to say actions are the, what did I say? Actions are the lock pick of the, they're the tumblers of the NGRX lock. And I found this Skyrim GIF. But this stuff is fluff. It's just for fun. It's just to keep people entertained. One thing that is different when I talk about actions, there's a difference between so this, I have login, I have handle redirect, I have login success and login failure. And that's not actually how this turned out in the sample app. So I want to update that a bit, because really what happened was you have login and logout, which basically just call the authentication service and you just get redirected to whatever provider you've got. I mean, in this case, it's Auth0, but it doesn't matter. It could be identity provider or what's that called? Identity server on .NET or whatever. Then when the handle redirect comes, then there's a handle redirect success. It's not really a login success. Then there's also load user success, check auth success are not authenticated. So I want to make sure I cover those since I talk about them in the talk, in the state portion. So I'll update that some. So to add code, another really great trick is to open a Visual Studio, create a Visual Studio Code folder, and make some special workplace settings. So I have like the font size set to 60, and I'm using this special syntax highlighting. Where is it? Color theme. Oops. Called red. And that's how I can get the code syntax highlighting. So what I can do is I can go over here, because I'm going to change this. So I can copy that. Oops. Go over to just code.ts. Copy that. Go over to Keynote. And paste that in. There's a little bit of finagling you have to do to get that formatting right. First of all, I take off, I don't like the italics there. So I change it all to bold. Take out the background color, which is here. Okay. And like expand that and put it in the center. I want to change some of this. You have to kind of mess with the spacing to make it look nice. I might not, I bet I didn't have prettier in that sample code because that's important. Oops. Okay. So now you can see I've got the code in there and it looks nice. And it matches the other ones. And so I can do that however much I need to. But that saves you a heck of a lot of time. If you try to do syntax highlighting in Keynote, you will jump off a bridge, because trying to highlight a single word and change the text color is just like horrible. So we talk about that. After we talk about good action hygiene, we want to talk about like what are the actions? What are the actions we need? So we want to talk about, I want to go through, how do we figure out state? Once we know what has to go in the store, then how do we change state, which is actions? You know, like what are the messages that we need to send around state? That's sort of what, let me write that down. What are the messages we need to send around state? And each time we're going to look at this flow of calling login, logging into the provider, being redirected, and handling some sort of redirect. I wonder how much time, going back to whether we should just cover logging in or also calling an API. Feels like you could make an entire 30-minute talk just about the login and logout flow and not even touch a bunch of other stuff. But I'll have to just sort of like work my way through that. Okay. Because what I'd like to show, yeah, we get back to actions, then we get into reducers. Which will be, we'll know we need to change something with the reducer when we have some sort of payload here. And then once that's all done, then we can define our selectors. then the auth service part sort of it's a new section, because now it's like this first part of defining, like setting up the state and reducers and selectors is sort of like everything that's going on internally to the application. And then we cross over into like using an auth service, like calling out to an external service, an external API. So it's sort of the end of the first chapter, if you will. We'll be getting here. So theoretically, I bet I should be somewhere about halfway done with this talk when I get to this point, depending on how much time I want to take. I may want this to be closer to like 10 minutes of the talk going through all this stuff. And then I want to dig a little bit deeper into translating between the vanilla Angular service and the effects. So with the auth service, I got to flesh out a lot more code here of like, what are we doing here with the auth service? And I guess it's going to be like, yeah, that's going to be like that. That's going to be over there. That's going to be over there. The one thing that drives me nuts about Keynote is when you move things around, it sort of automatically indents them. So it tries to group things together. And I don't find that very useful. Sometimes it's nice to have groups of things, but the indenting is so sensitive that I don't find it very useful. It's not a perfect system. Okay. Because what I want to do is I want to lead the audience to thinking through, okay, we've got all our sort of internal machinery working, and then we're going to look at the like calling out to our authentication using a service in Angular. But then how do we make those two things come together? Because and that's where effects, then you sort of discover with me that effects are the solution there. You're going to be and part of that because we don't want to have we don't really want logic in our, so let's think about like so like wrong answers only basically is here, which is like, where do we put this logic? If we put it all in the service, then you're sort of, you're losing out on the power of like indirection in NGRX. You're sort of, if everything we do is just calling the service to check if you're authenticated and calling the service inside of your components, right? Then you're just doing components to services, which you could make this work, but the problem is then you're going to have to make that call. Like, for example, for checking if you're authenticated, in order to show or hide pieces of the UI, you'll need to call that function on the service everywhere rather than just passively using selectors and things like that. So that's sort of part of the reason we want to do this. We want to be able to trigger a change in authentication in one place and update the rest of the app accordingly, as well as also on the auth server or the provider. And that's what leads us into thinking, oh, okay, so I guess where do we put side effects? We put them in effects. And so we go back and we look at this diagram again and we think about like, where do we need these effects? And we highlight these different things. And I gotta update all this code. It's a little bit out of date from some of these recent examples. But this is another animation I do where I hide everything that goes in exhaust map because this ends up expanding quite a bit. And then I expand it with an animation and move some things up and then like walk through it that way. You can do that. There's this thing in Keynote called Magic Move that lets you do these kinds of things. There's probably, where is an example? Probably there. If I go to there, wait, where is it? I know for a fact that there's a magic move there somewhere where it moves things around without having to explicitly do it. It's great stuff. So yeah, then we'll walk through all that code. Then this part is just sort of the wrap up of what we've covered. So I'll do that towards the end. So things are getting better. They're getting shaped up. And we're at like an hour and 20 minutes. Anyone have any questions that are coming up or anything else? I mean, if there's other things you want me to cover or explain, that's also welcome. I can walk you through any part of this process if you want to see me do something, or if you want to ask me other questions about speaking or other questions about pretty much anything else. I'm an open book. Yeah, let me look at the visual again, just see how this is going. So this is sort of the intro, which I need to work on, the bio slide. What do you do once you have the first version of your slides? Rehearsals. Yeah, so I rehearse quite a bit. I think I rehearse more than the average person because I really don't like rambling on stage. I have a tendency to ramble or like explain things multiple times. And what I really want to do is practice the wording. I want to explain things in the most succinct way possible. So once I have probably even like the state of this, I will probably run through it and see what happens. Just see where the flow is. In the early stages, I'll be sitting down at my computer and I'll just practice it. But I'll practice it as if it were real, and I'll walk through it. And then I will. Once it gets more refined, I'll actually practice it as if it. I'll actually practice it if it were real. So I'll stand up. Standing up while you practice is key if you're actually practicing, if you're rehearsing, because your brain works differently when you're standing up than when you're sitting down. I don't know why. When you're sitting in your comfy chair at your laptop or your computer with the key, using a key, that's a very different cognitive and psychological experience than when you're standing up. And you can practice when you're just getting started. I'd highly recommend practicing on camera, practicing on video, recording it, and watching yourself, because you can see, for example, I used to sway a lot. I used to do this. It was like I was doing like lazy jazzercise. I would just sort of like rock back and forth. I would also hold my hands up to my like chest, like as I didn't know what to do with them. So I had to practice. I had to watch myself on camera and practice standing still with my hands at my side and be okay with like being uncomfortable like that, because it feels uncomfortable on stage, but it's not actually uncomfortable to the audience. You ask, do you have your talk written in case you forget something? The only talk I've ever fully written out was the ngConf one, because it was only 5 minutes. So I actually did write that one out word for word and memorize it. At this point, I would say the shorter the talk is, the more crucial that is. And the more you practice a talk, the less you'll have to worry about it. Sometimes there's a phrase or a fact that I actually really do need to remember, in which case I'll use the speaker notes. If I show you let's see, I did this in the facades talk that I gave at Angular Connect. let me show you. Like, I wanted to be sure to put, I had to mention this thing about the CERN. And so I actually put, I really thought the number negative 271.3 degrees Celsius was cool. And so I wrote that in the notes. You have to be very careful with relying on notes, though. When you go to give your talk, not every venue will have the correct AV setup to where you can use your notes. So it's very risky to have to rely on your notes. So you want to practice it as much as you can. If you can figure out ahead of time with the venue what you need. Sometimes what you'll need to do is they'll only have one screen, but you can have your laptop or whatever up on stage, and so you can change the presenter mode to make your notes like super super big, so that if you're standing far away from the podium or something, you can still do it. But I've had many friends who have fully relied on their notes. I actually was just at a conference where the speaker couldn't use her notes, and she kind of freaked out because the AV setup, it wasn't her. First of all, she wasn't able to use her computer. Somebody the venue provided one. And so she had to pull an AV guy on stage and have them rework everything in order to get it to work, because she literally couldn't give her talk without her notes. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not ragging on her at all. That's very normal. Some people really need it, but it's just I've just come to realize that I just can't rely on it. I have to just practice a lot and try to remember as much as I can and practice the phrasing. Do you have time to check the equipment before your talk? If any conference worth its salt will have some sort of tech check. Usually that's it's usually the day of, the morning of, so you don't have a lot of time to adjust. If you know that you're going to be giving a talk at a conference, the big established ones will communicate a lot with you ahead of time. If they're not, then you can always reach out to them and say hey, I'm building out my talk. I want to know what the AV setup is, because I want to know if I'm going to have the phrase that you're looking for is comfort monitor. That's here, I'll write that in the chat. Comfort monitor is a second monitor on the stage to show your notes. That's I've found that it's hit or miss. Some of them do, some of them don't. So that's kind of what you're looking for. I wouldn't stress too much about it, but if you can get that information, it's helpful. But yeah, in general, I just try to not rely too much on my notes. I try to, if there's some phrase that I need to say, Kim, it's great. So Kim also has a tendency to ramble or explain things too much. So she actually uses her notes to remind her to stop talking about something, or she'll put the phrase that she wants to use and she'll write don't say anything else after this. You don't need to explain something 3 or 4 times. You just need to use a succinct phrase to explain it. So she uses her notes quite a bit, and I think she has just gotten really really good at doing some recon on the venue ahead of time so that she can use her notes as often as possible. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. Like I said, I can get really rambly and long-winded with explaining things, but hopefully it's helpful. I'm sure the more that I do these kinds of streams, the more succinct I'll get. What were the main mistakes new speakers always do and should avoid doing? For me, I think the most common is it's uncomfortable being on stage if you haven't done it much. And so you're going to have this urge to shrink. You're going to have this urge to do weird things with your hands or move around or like hide behind the podium or to like not speak not project, not be very loud. And when you feel that urge, you got to do the opposite. You need to like embrace it, get really comfortable just being normal on stage. So the best way I've found to deal with that is to practice on camera. Stand up, record yourself, watch yourself, and notice these things about yourself. I got to do some speaker training once, and that's what the guy said. He was basically like, when you feel like shrinking, expand. Like you have to remember that everything you do on stage, you need to exaggerate because people are viewing you at a much different scale than when you're talking to people in person. So don't be afraid to like project your voice, do a lot of energy, like it's a different skill set than just like having a conversation with someone. And it's scary at first, but it is like just a set of skills that you can learn and practice and get good at. Hi Sam, thanks for sharing NGRX content. Do you have a GitHub repo? Yeah, I do. It is, let's see here. This is the project. It is GitHub Nostalgia Mart. Paste that in. And you can sort of see it evolve over time. It's still a work in progress. There's still a lot I need to do with it, but if you go through some of the previous streams, and then I'll keep building it out on some of the future streams. It's kind of a fun project because it has an Express server that uses the IGDB video game database, and then uses NGRX on the front end. So it's fun. It's a fun project. Yeah. Thank you, sir or madam. I don't know. Everyone's welcome. Let's see. For the folks who are still here, do you have any other ideas on, like, is this kind of thing useful? Would it be helpful for me to like start a talk from scratch? Would it be helpful to talk about like CFPs? I'm sort of like, I'd really like to help more people get into this stuff. And I'm just going to sort of start building out content and figuring it out. Oh, good. I'm glad, Ben. Glad it's helpful. I do want to turn, I think I'll try to turn this into an article. I know we talked about that, Ben. It's really, written content takes so much more time and effort than video content. Sometimes it's just like so much easier. But the nice thing about written content is that you can go back to it and refer to it a bunch. And so I do want to turn this kind of thing into articles. No, Ben, I really love the questions, and it's good because it's helpful for me to hear questions because you're not going to be the only person who has them. Everybody's going to have really similar questions, I would imagine. So the more I can, get a read on that and answer them, they'll sort of be like headings to my articles and things like that. So it's totally great. And I've mentioned Kim a couple times. She's going to be sort of, me and Kim and Mike and some other people, we sort of got this idea in the Angular community of trying to build out more content for this kind of stuff. And so the questions are great. Questions are awesome. And it's hard once you've started doing a lot of talks, you start to get further and further away from the struggles that you had when you were getting started. Just like when you're learning to code, or you learn to you learn a new language, or you learn Redux for the first time. Then by the time you get more advanced, you're so far away from that learning process that it's hard to. The phrase that people say is the curse of knowledge. You have this curse of knowledge where you know things too well. What tips do you have to stop thinking of what people looking at you are actually thinking when you're doing your talk? The biggest thing I would say is like, you have to remember that public speaking is the number one fear that people have. Jerry Seinfeld has that joke that like more people would rather be dead than give the eulogy. And so generally speaking, your audience is going to be extremely empathetic. They're going to be they're poised to think positively of you. So unless you get up on stage and act like a total asshole, then people are going to be like very supportive of you in general. It's very rare for an audience member to be like looking to heckle you in a tech conference. You know what I mean? So the only time people will is if you come off as like an arrogant jerk. Then people are like, okay, like bring it on. But I've seen speakers like crash and burn and have to recover. And like sometimes it has the effect of like making people like them more because they can relate to it so well. Like I saw a speaker at NG Atlanta have some technical difficulties in her talk, but she was just like so authentic and genuine that like people just loved her and wanted to support her. And so like she got through it. You know, it was sort of embarrassing for her at first, but like everything, you know, she got back on the horse and like finished the talk and everything was good. You know, sometimes your demos aren't going to work. Sometimes things are going to go wrong, but like you just have to remember the audience is like almost always on your side. So that's a really good thing. I think the mindset is a really good thing to do. And like I said earlier, like just practicing a ton, being in front, like the more, like if you can do your talk at some local meetups, if you have local meetups around, the local meetups are the best proving ground because they, first of all, local meetups are always looking for speakers. They're desperate for speakers constantly. You can also, you don't have to be super professional. You know, you can be a beginner speaker. They're always looking for content. It's also a small audience, and I actually personally, I find that the smaller and more intimate crowds are like more intimidating. Like, so when you get up on stage in a big conference, you can't really see the audience because there's like a bunch of lights and stuff like that. So it's actually a little bit more nerve-wracking to go to a local meetup and talk in front of like 20 people who can actually like see everything you're doing, and like you can see their responses. You can see their eyes glazing over and they're looking at their phones and looking at their laptops. Like that's a really good like way to just throw yourself in the fire and get started. Because the bigger conferences that you'll eventually get to, there's sort of a moment of being scared, and then once you get started, you can't really see anything anyway, so you're sort of just alone. Guate Dev says, I'm currently working on authentication with NGRX, and I'm always wondering if I'm doing it right. Watching content is always help. That's awesome, because I had a feeling people were worrying about that or like doing that. The one thing that I want to dig into that I'm asking around in the community, so if you have any input on, the one thing that's tricky, and it's not just Angular or NGRX, but it seems like in NGRX it happens, is making sure the user is authenticated before any of the rest of the application loads is a little bit tricky, and that's what I'm going to dig into pretty soon. I was talking with Joanna Pierce, who works at Narwhal. She was having similar problems. She figured out how to do it, and I'm going to try to get her to either send me what she did or maybe come on the stream sometime and walk through it. Because with AngularJS, if any of you were using AngularJS, we had that app.run in the beginning that would run before anything else. And so like at my last job, we would go get the token and everything during app.run, and lo and behold, we'd be authenticated before the rest of the app loaded. Angular does have the app initializer, but I've been told by numerous people on the Angular team that that's not really the place that you're supposed to getting the token. I'm using NGRX on init effects to trigger authentication. I'll have to go look at that. Yeah, good call. I'll have to go check that out, because that's one thing that I want to do, because a lot of like, yeah, I'm not sure if it is either. That's why I want to find out what Joanna's doing with Narwhal, because it is a little tricky. Like at my last job, our main application was just internal, so there was no login button. It was like as soon as the app loaded, you had to redirect the user to go get the token and come back. So you didn't want any of the UI to load really, other than maybe like a placeholder shell or something like that. And I think that's pretty common. I think that's like a really common pattern for business, like, internal line of business apps and stuff like that. So I do want to work on solving that problem. What else? Yeah, I'd really like to. I want to figure out how to get guests on the stream so that I can. I'd like to do some like pair programming, pair mentoring, that kind of thing. I think that would be really fun. I just like clicked on the wrong thing here. Okay. I think, shoot, I just like lost a bunch of the chat stuff. So if anybody said anything in the last like 10 seconds, just say it again. But I think this is probably a decent stopping point. This was a little bit funky because it was partially done already, and I'm going to go back through and start cleaning it up. But happy to do more of this kind of thing. Or if you, I'm going to have to build out a talk on Gatsby authentication from scratch. So I'll probably just stream that whole process, because I still have to build out the sample code, and I have to do the outline, and I have to do, I think I showed, it's, I've got to do, figure out like, I think I'm going to use kind of the same or like a similar type of app for that one. But I know it's not Angular content or NGRX content, but I could do that as a way to like show you building a talk from scratch. As far as other NGRX content, I love NGRX. I'm still an NGRX fan. So if there's other NGRX content that you want to see, hit me up on Twitter or paste it in the chat or something like that. One of these days, I'm going to get Mike and Brandon on here. Mike is pretty busy the rest of the year, so I don't know if I'll be able to get him on the show between now and then, but it'd be great to have. I'll probably get like Wes Grimes and Tim DeShriver and stuff. I just have to figure out how to route all the audio in correctly. Sort of make an equivalent of Jason Langsdorf's show, but for the Angular NGRX scene. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, Brandon and Wes are amazing. There's, I guess you work with. Don't you work for Narwhal, Ben? Yeah. So you're coworkers with. I've just mentioned like 4 or 5 different Narwhal people. I forgot that you work for them. So it's like the Narwhal gang. Yeah, a little bit biased, but I'm biased too. Those people are all. I've been pals with them for a little while, so it's a lot of good folks. Yeah. If you have any other like problems you're working through on NGRX or anything like that, let me know. Even if I don't, I mean, what I'm kind of using Twitch for is like a experimentation ground, like a place to work through ideas and learn new things, or kind of hammer out some content, and then I'll turn that into. I'm starting to make. I've made some stuff for Thinkster and Egghead. I'd like to. There's not much NGRX content on Egghead. If that's something you would be interested in seeing, let me know. I'd like to start making some more content for Egghead on NGRX because I think that would be cool. Lucas Rubelkey has one course on it, which is cool. It's good. It's a good course. But like, I'd like to break it down into more like smaller lessons on like composing together selectors and things like that. Maybe adding facades or things like that. Yeah, Ben, you're absolutely welcome. Keep them coming. We'll be looking forward to meeting you in person as well. I'm sure we'll run into each other at some point. And please keep in touch. Let me know what other questions you have, or if you want any feedback on talks or outlines or anything like that. I'm an open book. So yeah. All right, everybody. Well, I appreciate you all being here. I'm gonna send you all over to John Lundquist. Well, let's see. John's making music in Logic. Jason Langsdorff is doing a bunch of crazy stuff, and he's got a lot of people watching. I'll send you over to John. He's a really awesome person. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I will see you very soon.